All right, I appreciate I am the very last talk between the beginning and the end. Thank you to the forum organizers for having me here today and for a wonderful 2 days. My name is Zakir Durumeric. I'm a professor of computer science at Stanford and also chief scientist at Censys, which is a company that broadly does very large-scale mapping of internet infrastructure and exposure. And so in short, I spend my days often looking at global trends today. What does exposure look like? What does vulnerability look like? What does attacker behavior today look like? And given that perspective, perhaps unsurprisingly, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges we're facing today. There's no doubt challenges that are going to surround new machine learning algorithms, large language models, quantum computing, but these aren't the types of problems that are really our challenges today. In many ways, these are challenges of the future, while we're still today, I think, trying to fix many of the problems from yesterday. There's certainly going to be nuance in these new machine learning models, in these new technologies. But I think what we need to talk about as well is the more fundamental, foundational problems that Brian touched on, and I want to touch on as well. The reality is that companies today, utilities, universities, hospitals, corporations, governments, face many of the same nation-state adversaries or nation-state funded adversaries. But the reality is that breaches today are not caused by unknown attacks, zero-day attacks, as you alluded to, right? These are oftentimes vulnerabilities that have sat there for hundreds of days. The reality is there's no need to use expensive zero-day attacks or to develop zero-day attacks when it's simply not necessary. It's simply possible to look for a vulnerability that's been there for 6 months or been there for a year or has been there for years. And in many ways, that's the state of the art in many of the attacks today, is we are exploiting vulnerabilities that have existed for months or years on these systems. And our adversaries know this, right? That there's just simply no need to develop these more complex attacks to think about a lot of these issues around issues like quantum security when indeed we simply haven't patched data. And I think, honestly, this has really been epitomized, right? If you look at the recent series of data breaches that have simply been caused by storage buckets on the internet, right? We've seen massive data breaches, governments, defense contractors, hospitals, universities, again, who've lost massive amounts of customer data about patient data, not due to any security vulnerability, but because they simply put it out on the internet and had no idea that it was there. Those are the attacks that we're facing today. Multiple recent studies have come out in the last year or two. What they have found is that on average, companies patch between 10 to 25% of the vulnerabilities that they have on the internet. So less than a quarter of vulnerabilities on the internet will actually be patched. And part of this problem is absolutely a resource issue, right? We have an absolute talent shortage in this space. We don't have enough people to patch many of these vulnerabilities. But much more than that is that we live in a very, I would say, data-rich but signal-poor environment. We simply today don't know how to prioritize what we do need to fix with the limited talent that we have. And there was always the hope that commercial threat intelligence would fix this, that commercial intelligence would help us understand which were the vulnerabilities that we needed to fix first, which of the IP addresses or hosts were the ones that were malicious. And I would argue that in many ways the market has failed in this space. Most CISOs will tell you that they don't look to vulnerability sort of feeds anymore. They don't look to threat intelligence feeds, and researchers see the same thing. When they compare these threat intelligence feeds to see what are the most important issues, these feeds don't overlap. You can buy dozens of different feeds, and each one of them will tell you something different, and many of them will have very little to do with the attacks that are actually taking place today. And as a result, we simply do not know what to prioritize in many cases as an industry. The state of the art oftentimes is looking at Twitter. It's understanding which CVEs or vulnerabilities are being most actively discussed on Twitter. And that's how we prioritize in this industry. We look at the unique identifier and we say, which one is being mentioned most? Which one has started to be mentioned more this week? And that's how we prioritize what's going to patch on the internet. And there's been great guidance recently. If you look at resources like the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerabilities List, this has been a fantastic resource that folks have been looking at, and I think it's something for us to push further. But I think we also have to recognize that oftentimes what ends up on these lists is also months behind weeks to months behind. Exploits end up on that list after most of these systems have already been exploited. In fact, that's sort of the definition of the list. It's known exploited vulnerabilities, right? So we add something to a list and tell people to prioritize based on what has already been exploited on the internet. And again, that's sort of the state of the art today. And so this brings me to my first point, which actually matches Brian's first point, despite the fact that we did not coordinate on this. We need to do a much better job helping people prioritize what they need to patch, how they use the limited resources that they have. And the only way we're going to get significantly better doing this is by having much better collaboration. And this has to be collaboration between private industry and governments, between intelligence. Each one of these parties has a unique puzzle piece here. But right now, we are not communicating. And it's something that we are going to continue to be retroactively learning what's going to be exploited based on what has already been exploited until we figure out how we're able to collaborate better together between these two groups. Governments can also play a crucial role, though, not in only developing policy, but also helping to disseminate tactical data. In many cases, we know how organizations are vulnerable on the internet today. Governments can help these organizations understand what they need to patch. They can also help them to understand what is actively exploitable. And in many cases, this is because there's a long tail of critical infrastructure companies that simply don't have security teams at all. If we look at hospitals, if we look at utilities, a lot of these are small organizations that, if we're lucky, have a CISO. If we're lucky, in some cases, maybe have a dedicated IT team. And this is a place where government can help. Right? In a lot of these cases, private industry knows about these vulnerabilities, knows about what is exploitable on the internet, and it's a matter of routing. It's a matter of getting the right data to the right people, to disseminate this data and to help people prioritize which of these vulnerabilities are the ones that they actually need to look at, which one is actually important. To give you a sense, most of these organizations are facing hundreds of different vulnerabilities, perhaps on a weekly basis. It's something that is so far untractable in terms of what these organizations can fix in practice. We have to tell them these are the 2 or the 3 that actually matter. And that, again, is just sort of the state of the world, the state of the industry. And I think we all wish it were better. I think we all wish that we were worried about issues like quantum computing, but it's simply not. In other cases, it's not even a security issue. If we look when, on the commercial side, when we talk to organizations about why vulnerabilities haven't been patched, what we found in many cases is that even for probably the most advanced companies, for Global 1000 companies, companies will not be aware of 25 to 30% of the assets they own, of the assets they have on the internet. In some cases, a lot of these companies may not even be aware on the security team of the subsidiaries that they have and that they're responsible for. And again, this is one of those conversations that I probably wouldn't have believed until I had it over and over again, where security teams didn't even know the companies that they were responsible for because organizations have begun to move so quickly because of M&A activity. But again, that's where we sit. And so the world has become much more complex through M&A activity, through cloud, through work from home. In many ways, we haven't caught up to this. And we haven't caught up to many of the fundamental problems we're going to have to solve in order to actually even get to security. Do we even know what we own? Do we have a list of the assets that we need to consider patching, of the software that we need to look for vulnerabilities for? And again, that's simply where we're at today as an industry. And so this brings me to my second point. We need to build a more fundamental understanding of what works and what doesn't work, where these problems emerge in practice. Oftentimes, they're organizational issues. They're more foundational issues to how organizations run rather than specific security threats or specific technologies. And again, we're only going to make sense of this through collaboration, by bringing government sector together, bringing academic researchers together, bringing these organizations together, private industry who has much of this data. Even today, within the private sector, much of this data is fractured. Certain organizations know what is vulnerable. Certain organizations know what is exploited. Certain organizations know which companies have actually paid out ransomware demands. None of that data is connected. And there's a role government can play here by bringing together this severely fractured ecosystem to start to make more fundamental progress, to understand end-to-end which vulnerabilities actually lead to exposure, which lead to ransomware. We don't know today. Third, we need to address the fundamental talent shortage that exists. And again, this is something that's only going to happen through collaboration. But today, we have a talent shortage on the ground, folks trying to actually prioritize these vulnerabilities. We also, though, are missing key talent in how we discuss these issues, how we communicate. How do we communicate and educate so that we can have successful conversations between boards and CISOs? How we can talk about this more as a risk mitigation issue than necessarily a security problem. But we need to come together to understand who we need to educate and how we're going to help address this talent shortage, because this isn't going to go away. I think we like to look at AI as a silver bullet, but AI is not going to solve these organizational challenges for us. They're not going to solve the fact that we don't have the data in the right places to start to analyze it. Until we solve some of these issues, AI is going to do very little for us. It's only once we have this data, once we understand these problems more foundationally, that we're going to be able to harness AI to be able to solve some of these issues. It's absolutely a tool. It's absolutely a tool we should be considering how we use, but we as an industry in many ways aren't there yet today until we better understand the problems that are happening and why people are being breached. That's what I have. Thank you.